Hey guys, tonight we descend into a place few dared to imagine. A place where every soul in ancient Greece believed they would one day walk, where a river of black water separates the world of the living from the realm of the dead, and a silent ferryman waits to take you across. Down here, kings and beggars stand side by side. Some wander endlessly through gray fields, some bask in eternal peace, and others face punishment so terrible their names became warnings for all time. Before we begin, if you enjoy quiet, dark stories from the past, you can support the channel with a free subscription. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I read every comment. It's always wild to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now, take a breath and settle in. This is Myth Night, where you relax and I tell you true stories from the forgotten past. And if you fall asleep before the end, that's okay. Some stories were made to be finished in dreams, far beneath the sunlit world of the living, where no bird has ever sung and no flower has ever bloomed, stretches a realm that every mortal soul must eventually enter. This is not the fiery pits of eternal punishment that later religions would imagine, but something far more complex and haunting. The Greek underworld, a vast kingdom where the dead continue their existence in forms both familiar and strange. To understand this shadowy realm, we must first abandon our modern assumptions about what awaits us after death. The Greeks didn't envision a simple division between heaven and hell, reward and punishment. Instead, they imagined a sophisticated afterlife that reflected the complexity of mortal existence itself. Death, in their understanding, wasn't an ending but a transformation, a passage from one form of being to another. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a great chasm that opens into the earth's very heart. The air grows cold as you peer into depths that seem to swallow light itself. This isn't the Christian hell of fire and brimstone, where souls suffer for their sins in eternal flames. The Greek underworld is a place of shadows and mist, of gray twilight that never brightens into day nor deepens into complete darkness. It's a realm governed by its own laws, populated by its own citizens, ruled by its own monarchs. The word Hades itself reveals the Greek understanding of death's nature. It comes from Aids, meaning the unseen or the invisible one. Death wasn't about punishment or reward in the afterlife. It was about becoming invisible to the living world, crossing the boundary between what can be seen and what remains hidden. The dead didn't disappear. They simply moved to a place where the living couldn't follow. This underworld served multiple purposes in Greek culture. It provided comfort to the grieving, assuring them that their loved ones continued to exist somewhere, even if that existence was different from life above ground. It offered a framework for understanding justice, suggesting that the deeds of a lifetime would eventually be weighed and judged. Most importantly, it gave meaning to mortal life by establishing that our choices and actions have consequences that extend beyond the grave. The Greeks understood death as the great equalizer. Rich and poor, slave and free, hero and coward, all would eventually make the same journey into the underworld's shadowy embrace. But this democratic approach to death didn't mean everyone received identical treatment. The afterlife reflected the life that preceded it, though often in ways that subverted earthly expectations. Unlike later religious traditions that emphasized moral purity as the path to salvation, Greek concepts of the afterlife were more concerned with the honor, proper burial, and the completion of earthly obligations. A hero who died gloriously in battle might find paradise, while a wealthy merchant who lived selfishly could face punishment. But a poor person who lived with honor and fulfilled their duties to family and community would be treated with respect in death. The underworld also served as a repository of wisdom and truth. The dead, freed from the illusions and passions of mortal existence, could see reality more clearly than the living. This is why heroes like Odysseus and Aeneas sought out the spirits of the departed when they needed guidance for crucial decisions. The underworld wasn't just a destination, it was a source of knowledge that couldn't be found in the world above. Greek mystery religions promised their initiates special knowledge about the afterlife that would improve their fate after death. The Eleusinian mysteries, devoted to Demeter and Persephone, offered hope that death wasn't truly final, that cycles of loss and renewal governed both crops and souls. These secret teachings suggested that understanding the proper relationship between life and death could transform the afterlife experience from mere existence into something approaching bliss. The physical description of the underworld varied among different sources, but certain elements remained constant. It was always beneath the earth, always dark or dimly lit, always separated from the world of the living by barriers that were difficult but not impossible to cross. Rivers flowed through it, dividing different regions and serving different purposes. Judges determined the fate of souls, though their decisions were based on earthly deeds rather than religious beliefs. What makes the Greek underworld particularly fascinating is how it reflected their understanding of consciousness itself. The dead retained their memories, their personalities, their relationships with other souls. Death didn't erase identity, it revealed it in its purest form, stripped of the physical limitations and social pretensions that complicated mortal existence. The underworld was also a place of reunion. Families separated by death would meet again in its shadowy halls. Lovers would find each other across the divide between life and death. Heroes would gather with other heroes, sharing stories of their earthly adventures. This communal aspect of the afterlife offered comfort to a people who valued social bonds and family connections above individual achievement. But perhaps most importantly, the Greek underworld represented their acceptance of mortality as a fundamental aspect of existence. They didn't rage against death or promise that faith could overcome it. Instead, they created a vision of the afterlife that acknowledged death's reality while maintaining hope that existence continued in some form. This mature acceptance of mortality allowed them to focus on living well rather than merely avoiding death. As we prepare to descend into this realm of shadows and memory, we must remember that we're not just exploring ancient superstitions or primitive attempts to explain the unexplainable. We're examining one of humanity's most sophisticated attempts to understand the relationship between life and death, between the seen and the unseen, between the temporary and the eternal. The Greek underworld offers insights into questions that every culture must answer. What happens when we die? Do our choices matter beyond the grave? How should the knowledge of mortality shape the way we live? The moment of death, according to Greek belief, marked the beginning of a journey that would take the soul through landscapes both familiar and impossible. But this wasn't a journey the dead could make alone. At the instant when breath left the body and eyes closed for the final time, a divine guide would appear to escort the newly departed soul on its path to the underworld. Hermes Psychopompos, and Hermes the guide of souls, materialized beside the deathbed with the silence of mist and the certainty of fate. He appeared not as the mischievous messenger God known to the living, but in a more solemn aspect, his usual smile replaced by an expression of infinite compassion and ancient wisdom. His winged sandals made no sound as he approached, and his caduceus, the golden staff that could open any door and smooth any path, glowed with a soft light that only the dead could see. The newly departed soul, still confused by the transition from life to death, would find comfort in Hermes' presence. He spoke in tones that recalled every gentle voice the soul had ever heard: mother's lullabies, lover's whispers, friend's encouragement. "Come," he would say, extending a hand that felt both substantial and ethereal. "It is time to see what lies beyond the veil." The journey from the place of death to the underworld's entrance took the soul through a landscape that existed somewhere between the physical world and pure spirit. They might pass through the familiar countryside where the deceased had lived, but everything appeared different now. Colors were muted to shades of gray and silver. Sounds came as if from a great distance, and the living moved like figures in a half-remembered dream. As they traveled, Hermes would explain what lay ahead, preparing the soul for the wonders and challenges of the underworld. He spoke of the rivers they would encounter, each with its own purpose and power. He described the judges who would weigh the soul's earthly deeds. He offered reassurance that while death was a great change, it wasn't an ending, but a transformation into a different kind of existence. The first landmark of the underworld proper was the river system that separated the realm of the dead from the world of the living. 5 rivers flowed through this shadowy landscape, each serving a specific function in the cosmic order of death and judgment. The Styx, most famous of these rivers, wound through the underworld like a great serpent of black water. Its name meant hateful or shuddering, reflecting the fear that even gods felt when confronting its power. This wasn't ordinary water. It was liquid oath, flowing commitment, the very essence of unbreakable promise. Gods who swore by the Styx found themselves bound by oaths that not even Zeus could revoke. The river's power came from its role as the ultimate boundary between truth and falsehood, life and death, the possible and the impossible. When a soul first glimpsed the Styx, they saw water so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface moved with currents that followed no earthly physics, sometimes flowing uphill, sometimes spiraling in patterns that hurt to watch too closely. Along its banks grew strange flowers that bloomed only in the presence of death, pale blossoms that gave off light but no warmth, their petals falling silently into the dark waters. The Acheron, river of woe, carried the grief of every mortal who had ever lived. Its waters, slightly less dark than the Styx, but far more turbulent, rushed and churned with the accumulated sorrow of humanity. Souls could hear voices in its flow, the cries of mothers who had lost children, the laments of lovers separated by death, the regrets of those who realized too late what they had lost or failed to do. The sound wasn't torturous but cleansing, like a final opportunity to fully feel the sadness of leaving the mortal world behind. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, moved with deceptive calm through landscapes of white sand and silver stones. Its clear waters looked inviting, almost refreshing after the dark intensity of the Styx and Acheron. But souls who drank from Lethe found their memories of mortal life fading like morning mist. This wasn't punishment, but mercy, a chance to let go of earthly attachments that would only cause pain in the afterlife. Some souls chose to drink deeply, erasing all memory of their former existence. Others took only small sips, keeping fragments of their mortal identity while releasing the sharp edges of grief and regret. The phlegethon burned without consuming, its flames dancing on the surface of waters that were themselves made of liquid fire. This river of burning didn't punish, it purified. Souls who had carried anger, hatred, or violence into death could bathe in its flames and emerge cleansed of the poisons that had corrupted their earthly existence. The fire burned away spiritual impurities without causing pain, leaving the soul in its essential state of peace. Finally, the Cocytus, river of lamentation provided a place where souls could release their deepest sorrows without shame. Its banks were lined with trees whose leaves whispered the names of the dead, creating a symphony of memory that honored every life that had ended. Here, souls could mourn not just their own deaths, but all the losses they had witnessed in life, friends who had died before them, opportunities that had passed, words that could never be unsaid. But to cross these rivers and enter the underworld proper, souls needed the services of the most famous ferryman in all mythology. Charon waited at the dock that served all 5 rivers, his ancient boat somehow capable of navigating waters of fire, forgetfulness, and sorrow with equal ease. Charon himself was a figure to inspire both fear and pity. Older than the gods themselves, he had ferried souls across the underworld's waters since death first entered the world. His face bore the accumulated weariness of countless eons. His eyes held the sadness of every farewell he had witnessed. His boat, worn smooth by millions of passengers, never became crowded no matter how many souls climbed aboard. It expanded and contracted according to need, sometimes carrying a single soul in solitary contemplation, sometimes holding entire armies who had fallen in a single battle. The ferryman's fee wasn't greed, but necessity. The dead needed to prove they had been properly buried, that the living had cared enough to place coins on their eyes or under their tongues. Souls who couldn't pay faced a terrible fate, wandering the shores of the underworld for 100 years before Charon would finally take pity and grant them passage. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty, but cosmic justice. Proper burial was the last gift the living could give the dead, and failure to provide it had consequences that extended far beyond the grave. As Charon's boat moved across the dark waters, souls experienced their final moments of transition from the world they had known to the realm they would inhabit for eternity. The crossing was always silent except for the gentle splash of the ferryman's oar and the whisper of water against the boat's ancient hull. During this voyage, souls often felt the last vestiges of their earthly concerns falling away, replaced by a growing awareness of the vast mystery they were about to enter. As Charon's boat reached the far shore of the river system, souls found themselves standing before the entrance to the underworld proper, a sight that would remain forever etched in their eternal memory. The gates themselves defied earthly description, appearing sometimes as massive portals of black stone carved with scenes from every death that had ever occurred, and sometimes as simple openings in the earth that nonetheless conveyed an overwhelming sense of finality and authority. The architecture of these gates reflected the Greeks' understanding that death was both universal and personal. From a distance, they appeared uniform, the same imposing barrier that every soul must pass. But as each individual approached, the gates seemed to transform, showing scenes and symbols specific to that person's life and death. A warrior might see battles carved in the stone. A mother might see images of children and family. An artist might see representations of beauty and creation. But it wasn't the gates themselves that commanded attention. It was their guardian, the 3-headed hound whose very existence seemed to embody the finality of death. Cerberus lay across the threshold like a living mountain, his enormous body blocking any unauthorized passage between the world of the dead and the realm of the living. Each of his 3 heads was larger than a lion, with eyes that burned like coals and teeth like ivory daggers. His coat was black as midnight, but it seemed to absorb light rather than simply reflecting none. The 3 heads of Cerberus weren't merely multiple versions of the same consciousness. Each served a distinct purpose in guarding the boundary between life and death. The right head looked toward the past, seeing every moment of a soul's mortal existence, understanding the full weight of their earthly deeds. The center head focused on the present, evaluating the soul's current state and readiness to enter the realm of the dead. The left head gazed into the future, perceiving what role this soul might play in the underworld's eternal drama. What made Cerberus particularly terrifying wasn't his size or his fierce appearance, but his selective permeability. The Great Hound allowed anyone to enter the underworld. He posed no threat to souls making their first journey into death, but he prevented anyone from leaving. His purpose wasn't to keep the living out, but to keep the dead in. This fundamental asymmetry made him a perfect symbol of death's one-way nature. You could check out of life any time you liked, but you could never leave. The sound of Cerberus was as intimidating as his appearance. When he breathed, it was like wind through caverns. When he moved, it was like earthquakes settling into place. When he growled, which he did whenever he sensed someone attempting to leave, without authorization, the sound echoed through every corner of the underworld, reminding all souls of the boundary they had crossed and could not uncross. But Cerberus wasn't merely a mindless guard dog. He possessed intelligence that bordered on omniscience regarding matters of death and passage. He could sense the difference between a soul that belonged in the underworld and a living person who had somehow found their way into the realm of the dead. He understood the complex rules that governed who could visit the underworld temporarily and who must remain forever. Most remarkably, he could be persuaded, but only by those who truly understood the nature of death and showed proper respect for the boundaries they sought to cross. The few living heroes who had managed to pass Cerberus did so not through force, but through understanding. Orpheus had played music so beautiful that it made even the great hound weep for all the beauty that death steals from the world. Heracles had wrestled with Cerberus not as an enemy but as an equal, gaining the beast's respect through courage and strength. Psyche had brought honey cakes that temporarily satisfied the hound's eternal hunger for the sweetness of life. Around the main gates, smaller guardians maintained watch over specific aspects of the death process. The Keres, spirits of violent death, fluttered on dark wings around the entrance, their presence ensuring that souls who had died in battle received the honor due to those who had faced death courageously. Their appearance was both beautiful and terrible, women with wings like ravens, eyes like stars, and voices like wind through armor. The Oneiroi, spirits of dreams, dwelt near the gates because death and sleep were understood to be closely related. The Greeks believed that dreams provided glimpses of the underworld, that sleep was a temporary form of death. These dream spirits helped newly arrived souls adjust to their new existence by weaving familiar images from their mortal lives into the strange new reality of the afterlife. Thanatos himself, the personification of death, maintained an office near the gates where he reviewed the cases of souls whose deaths had been particularly complex or controversial. Unlike the violent death spirits or the dream figures, Thanatos appeared as a young man of surpassing beauty, his face serene with the peace that comes from understanding that death is not an enemy, but a natural part of existence. His touch was gentle, his voice soothing, his presence a reminder that death could be a release from suffering rather than a source of fear. The judge's pavilion stood within sight of the gates, where 3 figures waited to evaluate each soul that passed through. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus had been kings in life, renowned for their wisdom and justice. In death, they served as arbiters of eternal fate, their decisions determining whether souls would spend eternity in punishment, reward, or the neutral existence of the asphodel fields. The judging process wasn't a trial in any legal sense. There were no lawyers, no arguments, no appeals. Instead, the judges possessed the ability to see directly into the soul's essence, understanding immediately the full scope of that person's earthly existence. They saw not just actions, but motivations, not just deeds, but their consequences, not just what someone had done, but who they truly were beneath all pretense and self-deception. Minos, the chief judge, carried a golden scepter that could weigh the moral weight of any action. When he pointed it at a soul, the scepter would glow with different colors depending on the nature of their earthly deeds: silver for acts of kindness, gold for courage, black for cruelty, red for anger. The pattern of colors created a unique signature for each soul, a kind of moral fingerprint that determined their ultimate destination. Rhadamanthus specialized in cases involving justice and law. Souls who had been judges, rulers, or law enforcement in life received particular attention from him. He understood the complexities of trying to maintain order in an imperfect world, and his judgments often reflected mercy for those who had tried to do right despite impossible circumstances. Aeacus handled matters involving family relationships and personal honor. He evaluated parents, children, spouses, and friends, understanding that these intimate connections often involved the most complex moral choices. His judgments considered not just what people had done to strangers, but how they had treated those closest to them. The area around the gates was filled with other figures from Greek mythology who served various administrative functions in the realm of the dead. Hermes remained present to help souls navigate the initial stages of their afterlife experience. Minor gods and goddesses handled specialized cases: souls of artists, soldiers, mothers, children, each receiving attention appropriate to their earthly roles. But perhaps the most important aspect of the gates was what they represented psychologically. Crossing them meant accepting the reality of death, letting go of any lingering attachment to mortal existence, and embracing whatever form of existence awaited in the underworld proper. The elaborate guardians and complex procedures served not just to maintain cosmic order, but to help souls process the enormous transition they were experiencing. Beyond the gates and guardians lay a landscape that stretched to horizons no mortal eye had ever seen, divided into distinct regions that reflected the Greeks' sophisticated understanding of moral complexity and human nature. This wasn't a simple binary of heaven and hell, but a nuanced geography of the soul that acknowledged the full spectrum of human experience and moral achievement. The largest and most populated region was the asphodel fields, vast meadows of gray flowers that stretched beyond the limits of sight. Here dwelt the majority of the dead, those whose lives had been neither notably virtuous nor particularly wicked, who had lived ordinary existences marked by the usual mixture of good and bad choices that characterized most human experience. The asphodel flowers themselves were peculiar to this realm of the dead. They grew without soil, bloomed without seasons, and gave off a pale light that was neither warm nor cold. Their petals never fell, their stems never broke, and their roots drew sustenance from the memories of mortal life, rather than from earth or water. Walking through these endless fields was like moving through a perpetual twilight that never deepened into darkness, nor brightened into day. Souls in the asphodel fields retained their memories and personalities, but experienced existence in a dreamlike state. They could recognize and communicate with other souls, but the sharp edges of earthly emotions, passion, ambition, desperation, overwhelming joy, were muted to gentler tones. This wasn't punishment, but rather a peaceful form of existence that allowed souls to reflect on their mortal lives without the urgency and confusion that had characterized their earthly experience. The landscape of the asphodel fields reflected this meditative quality. Gentle hills rolled away in all directions, covered with the pale flowers that gave the region its name. Small streams of clear water meandered between the hills, providing places where souls could sit and contemplate their former lives. Groves of trees with silver leaves offered shade that was somehow restful despite the absence of any sun to provide relief from. But not all souls were destined for this peaceful mediocrity. For those whose earthly lives had been marked by exceptional virtue, courage, or achievement, a very different fate awaited in the Elysian fields. This realm represented the Greeks' vision of paradise, not a place of eternal worship or religious ecstasy, but a perfected version of earthly life where all the best aspects of mortal existence could be enjoyed without the limitations and corruptions that had marred them in the world above. Elysium appeared as the most beautiful landscape imaginable, combining elements from every earthly paradise, but surpassing them all. Rolling hills covered with grass that seemed to emit its own green light stretched between groves of trees that bore fruit more perfect than any that had ever grown in mortal soil. Rivers of crystal clear water flowed between banks lined with flowers that released fragrances capable of inducing feelings of perfect contentment and peace. The heroes who dwelt in Elysium retained all their earthly vigor and ability, but freed from the constraints that had limited them in life. Achilles could run faster than any earthly wind without ever growing tired. Hercules could perform feats of strength that would have been impossible even for his legendary mortal form. Artists could create works of beauty that surpassed anything they had achieved in life, using materials that responded to their will and vision in ways that earthly media never could. But Elysium wasn't just about individual pleasure or achievement. It was a community of souls who had proven themselves worthy of each other's company through their earthly deeds. Heroes shared stories of their adventures with other heroes. Wise rulers consulted with other wise rulers about the art of governance. Poets collaborated with other poets on works that would never be seen by mortal eyes, but that added to the eternal treasury of beauty and truth. The architecture of Elysium reflected this sense of community and shared excellence. Beautiful buildings, constructed from materials that seemed to be made of solidified light, housed gatherings where souls could enjoy the company of others who had faced similar challenges and achieved similar levels of virtue. Gardens provided spaces for contemplation and conversation. Amphitheaters hosted performances that combined the greatest artistic achievements of all cultures and all eras. Time in Elysium moved differently than in the mortal world or even in the other regions of the underworld. Souls could spend what felt like eons exploring a single beautiful vista or engaging in a single perfect conversation, then discover that they had also simultaneously experienced countless other perfect moments. This wasn't confusion, but rather a form of temporal abundance that allowed infinite enjoyment without the passage of time that had made earthly pleasures so fleeting. At the opposite extreme from Elysium lay Tartarus, a realm of punishment that extended as far below the rest of the underworld as the earth was above it. This was where souls who had committed the most serious crimes, particularly those involving defiance of the gods or violations of fundamental moral principles, experienced consequences proportional to their earthly misdeeds. Tartarus wasn't designed around the concept of eternal torture for its own sake. Instead, it operated on principles of cosmic justice that sought to restore balance to the universe by ensuring that serious wrongdoing received appropriate consequences. The punishments were often poetic in nature, designed to help souls understand the true nature of their crimes and their effects on others. The landscape of Tartarus reflected its function as a place of correction and consequence. It was a realm of extremes. Burning deserts adjacent to frozen wastelands, towering mountains that reached impossible heights next to chasms that descended to unimaginable depths. The architecture was designed to create specific challenges for specific types of wrongdoing, with each punishment carefully crafted to address the particular moral failing that had brought a soul to this region. But even Tartarus wasn't conceived as eternal hopelessness. The Greeks believed that understanding and redemption were always possible, even for the worst offenders. Souls who truly comprehended the nature of their crimes and felt genuine remorse for the harm they had caused could eventually be transferred to other regions of the underworld where they could continue their eternal existence in more pleasant circumstances. The boundaries between these regions weren't fixed walls, but rather transitions that reflected the moral development of individual souls. A soul might begin its afterlife experience in the asphodel fields, then gradually earn a place in Elysium through continued moral growth and understanding. Conversely, souls who had initially been assigned to Elysium might find themselves moved to other regions if their eternal existence revealed character flaws that their earthly heroism had masked. This fluid geography of the afterlife reflected the Greeks' sophisticated understanding that moral development didn't end with death. The underworld provided opportunities for continued growth, learning, and moral evolution that were unavailable in the limited time span of mortal existence. Death wasn't the end of the soul's journey, but rather the beginning of a new phase of existence with its own challenges and opportunities. The administrative structure that governed these regions was as complex as the geography itself. Different gods and goddesses oversaw different aspects of underworld existence, ensuring that souls received treatment appropriate to their natures and needs. Minor deities specialized in particular types of cases: soldiers, artists, mothers, rulers, each bringing their own understanding and perspective to the eternal administration of justice and mercy. At the heart of this vast realm of shadows and memory sat the palace of the underworld's rulers, a structure that somehow managed to be both magnificent and melancholy, imposing and intimate. Built from obsidian that had been polished to mirror brightness, the palace reflected not the appearance of those who looked into its walls, but the essence of their souls, showing each observer exactly who they truly were beneath all pretense and self-deception. Hades himself ruled from a throne carved from a single massive block of black marble that had been shaped by the Cyclopes in the earliest days of the cosmos. The throne was both beautiful and terrible, its armrests formed like coiled serpents, its back rising in the shape of wings that might have belonged to an angel or a demon depending on how the light struck them. When Hades sat upon this throne, he became the very embodiment of death's inevitability, not cruel or kind, not angry or merciful, but simply final. The king of the dead was perhaps the most misunderstood of all the Greek gods. Later traditions would paint him as a figure of evil, a tempter and tormentor of mortal souls. But the Greeks themselves understood him very differently. Hades was stern but just, impartial but not heartless, distant but not indifferent. He ruled over death with the same kind of necessary authority that Zeus exercised over the sky, or Poseidon commanded over the seas. His appearance reflected this complex nature. Hades was tall and powerfully built, with the bearing of someone who had never doubted his authority or questioned his right to rule. His hair was dark as the deepest cave, his eyes held the depths of eternity, and his voice carried the weight of every final word ever spoken. When he spoke, it was with complete certainty and absolute knowledge. He never guessed, never wondered, never hoped. He simply knew. But perhaps, most remarkably, Hades was the only one of the three brother gods who had never betrayed his responsibilities or abandoned his duties for personal pleasure. While Zeus had countless affairs with mortal women, and Poseidon regularly interfered in earthly politics, Hades remained at his post, ensuring that the cosmic order of death and judgment continued to function properly. His dedication to duty was so complete that he rarely left his underground realm, and when he did, it was always for matters directly related to his responsibilities as Lord of the Dead. The kidnapping of Persephone represented the one great exception to Hades' otherwise perfect record of duty and restraint. But even this act, which later moralists would condemn as pure evil, was more complex in its original Greek context. Hades hadn't acted from mere lust or casual cruelty. He had fallen genuinely in love, perhaps the only time in his eternal existence that he had experienced an emotion stronger than duty. Persephone, when she first arrived in the underworld as Hades' unwilling bride, was indeed a victim of divine kidnapping. The story doesn't minimize this reality or excuse Hades' actions. She had been picking flowers in a sunny meadow with her friends when the earth split open and Hades emerged in his chariot to carry her away to his dark kingdom. She had screamed, fought, and wept as any young woman would when torn from everything familiar and beloved. But the myth also suggests that over time, something deeper developed between the Lord of the Dead and his captive queen. Perhaps it was Stockholm Syndrome, or perhaps it was genuine recognition of Hades' qualities that were hidden beneath his grim exterior. Persephone discovered that her husband, despite his fearsome reputation, treated her with respect and even tenderness. He never forced her to love him, never threatened her with punishment for her resistance, never tried to change her essential nature. Instead, Hades waited with the patience of eternity itself for Persephone to see beyond his role as death personified to the individual consciousness that lay beneath. He showed her the beauty that existed even in his dark realm, the silver flowers that bloomed only in the presence of death, the crystal formations that grew in caves untouched by sunlight, the profound peace that could only be found in places where earthly struggles had no meaning. Persephone, for her part, brought something to the underworld that it had never possessed, the perspective of life and growth, of seasons and change, of hope and renewal. Her presence softened the harsh edges of death's finality without eliminating its necessity. She became an advocate for souls who had been treated harshly by fate, a source of mercy that balanced Hades' inflexible justice. The pomegranate seeds that bound Persephone to the underworld represented more than just a legalistic trick to keep her from returning to her mother. They symbolized the way that experiencing death, even secondhand, changes a person permanently. Persephone could never again be the innocent girl who had picked flowers without thinking about mortality. She had seen the full scope of existence, including its ending, and that knowledge had transformed her into someone capable of ruling over death itself. As queen of the underworld, Persephone developed her own court and her own responsibilities. She became the patron of souls who had died young, particularly young women who had been cut down before they could fulfill their potential. She offered comfort to mothers who had lost children and children who had lost mothers. Her presence in the underworld provided a maternal influence that complemented Hades' paternal authority. The seasonal cycle that resulted from Persephone's dual existence, half the year in the underworld with Hades, half the year above ground with her mother Demeter, created one of the most important myths in Greek culture. When Persephone descended to her throne beside Hades, the world above entered winter, as if all of nature mourned her absence. When she returned to the surface, spring exploded across the landscape in celebration of her homecoming. But this wasn't just a story about changing seasons. It was a profound meditation on the relationship between life and death, on the necessity of both loss and renewal in the cosmic order. Persephone's annual journey between the worlds represented the cycle that governs all existence: birth, growth, decline, death and rebirth. She embodied the truth that life and death aren't opposites, but partners in the dance of existence. The relationship between Hades and Persephone also challenged conventional assumptions about power and gender in the ancient world. While Hades possessed ultimate authority in the underworld, he consistently treated Persephone as an equal partner in ruling their realm. She had her own court, her own areas of responsibility, her own authority that even Hades respected. Their marriage became a model of partnership that was remarkably progressive for its time. Together, the Dark Monarchs created a form of governance that was more just and more compassionate than either could have achieved alone. Hades provided the strength and impartiality necessary to maintain cosmic order. Persephone offered the wisdom and mercy needed to ensure that justice didn't become mere retribution. Their combined rule made the underworld a place where souls could find not just the fate they deserved, but the understanding they needed to make sense of their eternal existence. The palace where they held court was designed to reflect this partnership. Hades's throne was carved from black marble, representing the finality and authority of death. Persephone's throne was made from the white marble streaked with veins of silver, symbolizing hope and renewal even in the midst of endings. Between them stood a table made from wood that had grown in the upper world but had been carved by underworld craftsmen, a symbol of the connection between life and death that their marriage represented. The underworld wasn't simply a destination where souls waited in eternal stasis. It was a place where the most profound dramas of existence played out, where love proved stronger than death, where heroes faced their ultimate tests, and where the consequences of mortal choices echoed through eternity. The stories that emerged from this realm of shadows revealed truths about human nature that could be discovered nowhere else. The most famous of all underworld journeys belonged to Orpheus, the musician whose talent transcended the boundary between art and magic. When his beloved wife, Eurydice, died from a serpent's bite on their wedding day, Orpheus faced a choice that defined the very nature of love itself. He could accept her death and try to build a new life, or he could attempt something that had never been done, travel to the underworld while still alive and demand her return. Orpheus chose love over prudence, hope over acceptance. With his lyre in hand and his heart full of music that could move stones to tears, he descended through the caves that led to Hades' realm. His music announced his presence long before he reached the gates, melodies so beautiful that even Cerberus lay down and whimpered like a lonely puppy, all three heads overwhelmed by the sound of perfect love expressed in perfect art. As Orpheus traveled through the underworld, his music created unprecedented scenes. The shades in the asphodel fields stopped their eternal wandering to listen, tears streaming down faces that hadn't wept since the moment of death. In Tartarus, the eternally punished paused in their torments. Sisyphus sat down on his boulder. Tantalus forgot his thirst. The Danaids stopped trying to fill their broken jars. Even the Furies, who knew only vengeance and anger, found themselves moved by melodies that spoke of love so pure it could challenge the very structure of reality. When Orpheus finally stood before the thrones of Hades and Persephone, he didn't demand or threaten. Instead, he simply played songs that told the story of his love for Eurydice, their brief happiness, and the emptiness that her death had created in his soul. His music painted pictures of their wedding day, their shared dreams, the future they would never have. It spoke of love that didn't diminish with death, but grew stronger in the face of loss. The effect on the rulers of the dead was unprecedented. Hades, who had never shown mercy to any petitioner, felt tears running down his face. Persephone, who understood both love and loss more deeply than any other immortal, was so moved that she rose from her throne and pleaded with her husband to grant this unprecedented request. For the first time in the history of the Underworld, death itself was being asked to surrender one of its claims. Hades agreed, but with a condition that revealed his deep understanding of human nature. Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the world of the living, but he must not look back at her until they both reached the surface. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty, but rather a test of the very love that Orpheus claimed was stronger than death. Could he trust completely? Could he believe without seeing? Could his love survive doubt? The journey back was torture for both lovers. Orpheus could hear Eurydice's footsteps behind him, could sense her presence, but couldn't see her face or touch her hand. As they climbed through the dark passages toward the light, doubt crept into his mind like poison. What if Hades had deceived him? What if she wasn't really there? What if he was leading nothing but shadows and hope? Just steps away from the surface, with sunlight visible ahead, Orpheus's faith cracked. He turned around, and for one precious moment, he saw Eurydice's face, radiant with love, joy at their almost reunion, and infinite sadness at his lack of trust. Then she began to fade, becoming transparent as the underworld reclaimed her, this time forever. Farewell, she whispered, and was gone. Orpheus had learned that love alone, however perfect, wasn't enough to overcome death. Love required trust, faith, and the willingness to believe in what couldn't be seen or proven. His failure wasn't one of love, but of faith, and in failing, he discovered that some losses are so final that even the gods cannot undo them. Another legendary journey to the underworld belonged to Heracles, whose 12th and final labor required him to capture Cerberus and bring the three-headed hound to the surface world. This task was different from his previous labors. It couldn't be accomplished through strength alone, but required courage, wisdom, and respect for powers greater than any mortal hero. Heracles' descent to the underworld was guided by the mysteries of Eleusis, which had taught him the proper rituals and attitudes necessary for a living person to enter the realm of the dead. He approached not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant, acknowledging the authority of Hades and Persephone over their domain. When he stood before their thrones, he didn't demand the right to take Cerberus, but asked permission, explaining his situation and accepting whatever conditions the rulers of the dead might impose. Hades, impressed by the hero's respect and humility, agreed to allow Heracles to attempt the capture of Cerberus, but only if he could subdue the great hound without using weapons. This condition reflected the deeper meaning of the labor. Heracles had to prove that he could overcome death not through violence, but through understanding and strength of character. The wrestling match between hero and hound was more than physical combat. It was a spiritual test that pushed Heracles to the very limits of his mortal nature. Cerberus fought not to kill, but to teach, showing Heracles that true heroism required confronting the reality of mortality without being paralyzed by fear. When Heracles finally subdued the great hound, he had achieved something more valuable than victory. He had gained the wisdom that comes from facing death and finding the courage to continue living. The story of Sisyphus revealed another aspect of the underworld's justice. This king had been the cleverest mortal who ever lived, but he had used his intelligence for selfish purposes, cheating both gods and men without consideration for the consequences of his actions. His punishment in Tartarus, eternally pushing a boulder up a mountain only to watch it roll back down, seemed perfectly suited to his crimes. But Sisyphus had also tried to cheat death itself. When Thanatos came to claim him, Sisyphus had tricked the death god into chains, creating a period when no one in the world could die. This disruption of cosmic order had far-reaching consequences. Soldiers wounded in battle couldn't die and end their suffering. Sick people couldn't find release from pain, and the natural cycle of life and death was suspended. The punishment of Sisyphus represented more than just divine vengeance. It was a restoration of cosmic balance. His eternal futile labor served as a reminder that some forces cannot be cheated or avoided, that cleverness without wisdom leads to destruction, and that actions have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate effects. Tantalus, punished alongside Sisyphus in Tartarus, had committed crimes that struck at the very heart of civilized existence. He had killed his own son and served the child's flesh to the gods as a test of their omniscience. This violation of the most fundamental bonds of family and hospitality had earned him a punishment that matched his crime: eternal hunger and thirst in the presence of food and water that always moved just beyond his reach. The punishment of Tantalus spoke to Greek understanding of the relationship between civilization and barbarism. The bonds that held society together, family loyalty, hospitality to guests, respect for the sacred, were not arbitrary rules, but necessary foundations of human community. Violating these bonds didn't just harm individuals, but threatened the entire structure of civilized existence. Ixion's punishment revealed another aspect of divine justice. This king had lusted after Hera, Zeus's wife, and had attempted to seduce her. Zeus had created a cloud image of Hera to test Ixion's intentions, and when Ixion had indeed tried to seduce what he thought was the queen of the gods, his fate was sealed. He was bound to a fiery wheel that spun eternally through the underworld, never able to rest or find peace. The punishment of Ixion represented the consequences of uncontrolled desire and the violation of sacred boundaries. His eternal spinning reflected the way that unchecked lust consumes itself, creating endless motion without progress, endless desire without satisfaction. These stories of punishment weren't meant to terrify, but to instruct. They showed that the cosmos operated according to moral principles that applied to gods and mortals alike, that actions had consequences that extended beyond death, and that justice, however delayed, was ultimately inescapable. The underworld served not just as a destination for the dead, but as a theater where the eternal principles of right and wrong played out their cosmic drama. The Greek underworld was far more than a collection of stories about what happened after death. It was a sophisticated, philosophical, and psychological system that addressed fundamental questions about human existence, moral responsibility, and the nature of consciousness itself. To understand its true significance, we must look beyond the surface narratives to the deeper truths these myths were designed to convey. At its most basic level, the underworld served as a moral compass for Greek society. In a culture without sacred texts or unified religious authority, the stories of eternal punishment and reward provided guidelines for ethical behavior. The knowledge that Tantalus suffered eternally for violating hospitality encouraged Greeks to honor their guests. The understanding that Sisyphus faced endless futility for his deceptions motivated people to value honesty and integrity. But the moral lessons went deeper than simple behavior modification. The underworld myths explored the psychological consequences of moral choices. Sisyphus's eternal boulder pushing wasn't just punishment, it was a perfect metaphor for the kind of meaningless existence that results from a life devoted to clever manipulation rather than genuine achievement. His punishment reflected the internal reality of people who spend their lives trying to get something for nothing, only to discover that such efforts ultimately lead nowhere. The geography of the afterlife mirrored the geography of the human psyche. The asphodel fields represented the vast majority of human experience, neither extremely good nor extremely bad, but simply ordinary. This wasn't condemnation of mediocrity, but a recognition that most people lived complex lives with mixtures of virtue and vice, achievement and failure, love and selfishness. The Greeks understood that moral perfection was rare and that most souls deserved neither eternal bliss nor eternal torment. Elysium represented the human potential for greatness, not just heroic achievement, but the fulfillment of whatever excellence a person was capable of. The heroes who dwelt there had realized their full potential as human beings, becoming examples of what mortals could achieve when they fully embraced their capacity for courage, wisdom, and virtue. Tartarus served as a warning about the consequences of rejecting fundamental human values. The souls punished there hadn't just broken rules, they had violated the basic principles that make civilization possible. Their punishments reflected the internal reality of people who choose selfishness over community, deception over truth, violence over justice. The figure of Hades himself embodied one of the Greeks' most sophisticated insights about power and authority. Unlike other gods who ruled through charisma, fear, or manipulation, Hades governed through acceptance of necessity. He understood that death wasn't something to be avoided or overcome, but rather a fundamental aspect of existence that had to be accepted and integrated into a meaningful life philosophy. This acceptance of mortality gave Greek culture a unique perspective on the relationship between life and death. Rather than viewing death as the ultimate evil to be avoided at all costs, they saw it as the context that gave life meaning. The knowledge that life was limited made choices matter more, not less. The certainty of death motivated people to use their time wisely and to create something lasting through their words and deeds. Persephone's dual existence between the upper and lower worlds represented the psychological integration of life and death that mature individuals needed to achieve. Her seasonal journey wasn't just an explanation for agricultural cycles, but a metaphor for the emotional and spiritual cycles that govern human development. Everyone needed to spend time in their own underworld, confronting their shadows, understanding their limitations, accepting their mortality, before they could fully appreciate the light and beauty of ordinary existence. The influence of these underworld myths extended far beyond ancient Greece. Early Christian theologians, despite their rejection of pagan mythology, incorporated many underworld concepts into their own theology. The idea of eternal punishment for sin, the notion of judgment after death, the concept of different destinations for different types of souls. All of these Christian beliefs showed clear influence from Greek underworld mythology. Medieval literature drew heavily on underworld imagery and themes. Dante's Divine Comedy was explicitly structured as a journey through the afterlife that paralleled the journeys of Orpheus, Heracles, and other mythological heroes. The moral geography of Dante's afterlife, with its careful gradations of punishment and reward, reflected the same sophisticated understanding of moral complexity that had characterized the Greek underworld. Renaissance art found inspiration in underworld myths, using them to explore psychological and philosophical themes. Artists like Botticelli and Rubens created masterpieces depicting scenes from these stories, but their paintings spoke to contemporary concerns about love, death, power, and justice, rather than just illustrating ancient tales. Modern psychology has found the underworld myths particularly rich in insight. Carl Jung identified archetypal patterns in these stories that reflected universal aspects of human psychological development. The journey to the underworld became a metaphor for the process of confronting the unconscious mind, integrating shadow aspects of personality, and achieving psychological wholeness. Freud saw in the Orpheus myth a perfect illustration of the relationship between love and death instincts. The prohibition against looking back represented the unconscious mind's understanding that some losses cannot be recovered, that psychological health requires accepting painful realities rather than trying to undo them through wishful thinking. Contemporary literature continues to draw on underworld imagery and themes. Writers like Neil Gaiman, Rick Riordan, and Madeline Miller have created modern retellings of Greek underworld myths that speak to contemporary concerns about death, meaning, and moral responsibility. These modern versions preserve the essential insights of the original stories while translating them into forms that speak to contemporary audiences. The concept of the hero's journey that has become central to modern storytelling theory draws heavily on the pattern established by mythological journeys to the underworld. The descent into darkness, the confrontation with death or ultimate challenge, and the return with new wisdom has become the template for countless novels, films, and television shows. Video games have found underworld mythology particularly fertile ground for exploration. Games like Hades allow players to directly experience the mythological underworld while exploring themes of family, duty, redemption, and the relationship between fate and free will. These interactive experiences provide new ways to engage with ancient wisdom while addressing contemporary questions about choice, consequence, and meaning. The persistence of underworld imagery in popular culture suggests that these ancient stories continue to address fundamental human needs. In an age when traditional religious authority has weakened and scientific materialism often provides little comfort in the face of mortality, the Greek underworld myths offer a middle path, acknowledging the reality of death while maintaining hope for meaning and continuity. As we reach the end of our journey through the shadowy realm that the Greeks built in their imagination, we find ourselves confronting a startling realization. The underworld they created was never really about death at all. It was about life, about how to live with meaning in the face of mortality, about how to make choices that matter when everything seems temporary, about how to find hope in the midst of loss. The rivers that carried souls into the afterlife, Styx with its binding oaths, Acheron with its accumulated sorrows, Lethe with its merciful forgetfulness, represented the emotional and spiritual passages that every living person must navigate. We all cross these rivers during our lifetimes, learning to keep our promises despite difficulty, processing grief and loss, choosing what to remember and what to release. The guardians and judges of the dead reflected the internal processes by which we evaluate our own choices and character. Cerberus, preventing return from the underworld, represented the psychological truth that some experiences change us so fundamentally that we can never go back to who we were before. The three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, embodied the moral sense that most people carry within themselves, the inner voice that evaluates actions and motivations according to standards of justice, family loyalty, and personal honor. The geography of the afterlife mapped the landscape of human moral and emotional experience. The asphodel fields acknowledged that most of life is lived in the middle ground between extreme virtue and extreme vice, in the ordinary space where people struggle with everyday choices and mixed motivations. Elysium represented the human potential for excellence, not perfection, but the fulfillment of whatever capacity for greatness exists within each individual. Tartarus warned of the psychological and spiritual consequences of rejecting the values that make human community possible. The stories of famous underworld journeys revealed the truths about the human condition that remained relevant across centuries and cultures. Orpheus's failed attempt to reclaim Eurydice spoke to anyone who had ever tried to undo a loss through sheer force of will, only to discover that some things cannot be recovered, only accepted and integrated into a new understanding of life. His story taught that love, however powerful, must be balanced with trust and faith to achieve its full potential. Heracles' capture of Cerberus demonstrated that confronting mortality, symbolically wrestling with death itself, could be a source of strength rather than defeat. His success came not from avoiding or denying death, but from facing it directly and finding the courage to continue living with full awareness of life's limitations. The punishments of Sisyphus, Tantalus, and Ixion served as warnings about the psychological consequences of living without regard for moral principles. Their eternal sufferings reflected the internal reality of people who choose manipulation over honesty, selfishness over community, and unchecked desire over wisdom and restraint. Hades and Persephone, the dark monarchs of this realm, represented aspects of consciousness that modern psychology would recognize as essential for mental health. Hades embodied the capacity to accept reality, however painful, and to make decisions based on necessity rather than wishful thinking. Persephone represented the ability to integrate difficult experiences, even trauma, into a broader understanding of life that included both light and shadow, growth and decay, beginning and ending. The seasonal cycle that resulted from Persephone's dual existence offered hope that loss and renewal were part of the same eternal process. Her annual return from the underworld suggested that even the deepest descent into darkness could be followed by return to light, that endings could become beginnings, so that death itself might be part of a larger pattern of transformation rather than simple termination. This sophisticated understanding of the relationship between life and death gave Greek culture a psychological resilience that has influenced Western civilization for over 2 millennia. By creating myths that acknowledged suffering while maintaining hope, that accepted mortality while affirming meaning, they developed tools for coping with the fundamental challenges of human existence that remain useful today. The underworld myths also revealed the Greeks' understanding that individual existence was always embedded in larger communities and cosmic orders. The dead didn't simply disappear, but continued to be part of the larger story of existence, influencing the living through memory, example, and the moral weight of their earthly choices. This perspective encouraged people to consider how their actions would be remembered and evaluated, not just by other people but by whatever forces governed the universe itself. Perhaps most remarkably, these ancient stories managed to discuss death and judgment without falling into either nihilistic despair or naive optimism. They acknowledged that existence was difficult, that suffering was real, that injustice often prevailed in earthly life. But they also insisted that meaning could be found, that choices mattered, that consciousness itself was valuable enough to justify the struggles required to maintain it. In our contemporary world, where traditional religious certainties have weakened, but scientific materialism often provides cold comfort in the face of mortality, the Greek underworld myths offer a third alternative. They suggest that we can acknowledge the reality of death without becoming paralyzed by fear, that we can accept uncertainty about ultimate meaning while still finding purpose in immediate choices, that we can embrace both the light and shadow aspects of existence without losing hope. The question these ancient stories leave us with is not whether there really is an underworld where souls continue to exist after death. The question is whether we have the courage to live as if our choices matter, as if consciousness is precious, as if love and justice and beauty are worth pursuing even in the face of mortality and uncertainty. The Greeks who created these myths understood that the underworld existed first and foremost in the human heart, in our capacity to imagine consequences that extend beyond immediate experience, in our ability to feel responsible for more than just our own immediate gratification, in our persistent hope that meaning can be found even in the midst of loss and limitation. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you not fear of judgment in some distant afterlife, but appreciation for the remarkable gift of consciousness that allows you to contemplate these questions at all. The true underworld is the depth within your own soul where you wrestle with questions of meaning and purpose, where you evaluate your choices and character, where you decide what kind of person you want to be in the brief time you have been given. In that internal underworld, you are both judge and judged, both hero and ordinary soul, both seeker and guide. The wisdom of the ancient Greeks suggests that how you navigate that inner landscape, with courage or cowardice, with honesty or self-deception, with love or fear, determines not just how you will be remembered, but who you actually are in the deepest sense of that word. Sleep well, knowing that the journey continues, that consciousness itself is the true adventure, and that every choice you make adds another page to the eternal story of what it means to be human in a mysterious and beautiful universe.